Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen in on a discussion hosted by Clint Work of 38 North and the Stimson Center between General Vincent Brooks, a senior fellow at the Clements Center in the University of Texas, Austin, and Sheena Greitens, professor at the University of Texas, Austin. The discussion revolves around the Korean Peninsula. It's a wide-ranging talk that touches on everything from responses to COVID to what to expect with a potential change in administrations to Kim Jong-un's Christmas surprise. Overall, this group of experts assesses the security situation on the peninsula and how it is that affects us here in the United States. Let's listen in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of both the Stimson Center and the Clements Center for National Security, I'd like to thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Paul Edgar. I'm the Associate Director of the Clements Center, and it's a distinct honor to introduce our guests this afternoon who will engage in a conversation that we've titled, "It's Not Just Over There, the American Commitment to the Korean Peninsula." Our moderator is Dr. Clint Work. Clint is jointly appointed to the Stimson Center's 38 North program and the Security for a New Century program. He is, of course, an expert on Korea, and thus why he's selected as our moderator. Our two featured speakers include the Clements Center's own Dr. Sheena Greitens and General Vince Brooks. Dr. Greitens is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. She's affiliated with both the Clements Center and the Strauss Center, and to say that Sheena is an expert on Korea is an understatement. Hardly a week passes by that we don't see her quoted at length in the press or sought out by our senior leaders in order to help them understand a variety of issues. General Brooks, a Clements Center Distinguished Senior Fellow, is a career Army officer who recently retired from active duty as the 4-star flag officer in command of all U.S. forces in Korea, as well as the two parallel commands called the Republic of Korea U.S. Combined Forces Command and United Nations Command. Among the various positions he currently holds, he is the president of the Korea Defense Veterans Association. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Clint, and you please engage in a conversation. We look forward to it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Paul. And thank you to you, Elizabeth Dowdy, and the entire Clements Center for your partnership on today's timely program. Our program is part of the Stimson Center and 38 North's outreach on Korean peace and security issues outside of the DC Beltway. And due to your efforts at the Clements Center, we have a really nice array of attendees in the Austin area and the state of Texas. So thank you for helping us achieve that important goal of ours. I just want to provide a few contextualizing remarks before I turn to our speakers. As the audience may be or may not be aware, the Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War. Situated between World War II and Vietnam, it often receives sort of short shrift by historians and the US public alike. But in Korea, both North and South, the war is hardly forgotten. It lives on in the political culture and in the familial and psychological fabric of a still divided and heavily militarized peninsula. However, it doesn't just live on in the lives of the Korean people. It's also a quintessentially American story and not something that's just over there. Even if it's not foremost in the public consciousness, it was the Korean War that catalyzed the globalized American conception of national security in the early Cold War years, and the wide-ranging military basing and alliance system that underpinned it. And the U.S. presence in South Korea and commitment to South Korea today remains a crucial node within that wider strategic tapestry or architecture. But the war lives on in other ways too. After all, the war has not ended. This is evident in the Korean War Armistice Agreement, which is a cessation of hostilities rather than a formal peace treaty. But it's also embodied in deeply fixed mindsets in Pyongyang, Seoul, and in Washington, D.C. This is understandable, but the truth is, if we do not begin to collectively re-examine the endless war mindset, it's my feeling that no real progress toward peace or a more stable diplomatic solution is really possible. So the Korean War may be deemed forgotten by some, and our attention span toward Korea may be frustratingly episodic, but there are multiple enduring links between the US and the Korean Peninsula, and indeed between the state of Texas and the Korean Peninsula, which I may touch on later. And we have two outstanding speakers to help us explore some of these links. Now, Paul did some of my work for me up front, so I won't run through General Brooks's bio. It's featured on the event notice, but I do want to mention just a few salient points. His first deployment in Korea, long before he commanded U.S. and alliance forces, was in 1996 to 98 as a battalion commander right up near the DMZ. And years later, after extensive experience at the Pentagon and in the Middle East, he served as commander of the U.S. Army Pacific from 2013 to 16 during the so-called pivot or rebalance to Asia. And then it was in April of 2016 that he went to Seoul as the four-star commander. During his time there, it was quite eventful, if you might recall. He saw the South Korean executive branch change hands from a conservative to a progressive administration through an impeachment and early election process. He served two different U.S. presidents from opposing parties. And of course, I think as we all remember, he commanded during an alarming uptick in North Korea's nuclear and missile testing, and then the sudden shift to historic diplomacy between the U.S. and North Korea and the two Koreas. And furthermore, for 15 of those 30 months, there was not a U.S. ambassador that had been appointed. So he had to serve and sort of stretch beyond traditional military considerations. So we're very pleased to have him here today to share his insight. And also want to thank General Brooks and KDVA, the Korea Defense Veterans Association, for its continued support for our programming. Our next speaker, as has been mentioned, is Dr. Sheena Greitens, and I was gonna say a few things that Paul already sort of mentioned, so that's okay. That saves me the time. I will just say, in addition to all of her expertise and experience that Paul rightly laid out, the first time I met Sheena, I think I was trying to pin it down, was in the summer of 2015, I believe, in Seoul, and I think she was putting the finishing touches on her book then. And I knew of her then from others, from mutual acquaintances, as an up-and-coming academic and analyst. And she's only continued her steady, expected, but no less impressive rise in the field. So it's very nice to share this virtual panel with you today, Sheena. Just quickly, the format of our program today. The first portion will be a semi-structured conversation between myself and our two speakers. And then around the 45-minute mark or so, I'll turn to audience Q&A. The chat box is disabled for the audience, but the Q&A box is open. So please feel free to enter questions there as we go through our conversation, as they're sparked. And we'll queue them up for our Q&A. And I also want to flag now that during our Q&A, we will pose 3 polling questions to you, our audience, to get a sense of your collective sentiment on some of the issues that we're going to discuss today. So with that said, without further ado, I want to turn to our first topic of discussion, which is North Korea. And I want to direct the question first to you, General Brooks. And this is a question that I had the good fortune to pose to Generals Scaparrotti and Sharp, predecessors of yours as 4-star flag officers on the Korean Peninsula. And it is currently in U.S.-North Korean relations, we're somewhere between the escalatory rhetoric and behavior of 2016 and 17 and the historic sort of hopeful diplomacy of 2018 and early 2019. Where do you see events trending in the coming months and beyond? And as best you can tell, what are North Korea's intentions? What complicates and hinders Kim Jong-un's and the North Korean regime's decision-making? And maybe more immediately, has COVID impacted U.S.-North Korean relations at all?
Well, first, Clint, thanks so much for moderating for us today, and it's an honor to be with you. And I thank Paul Edgar and the Clements Center as well, with whom I'm associated and affiliated. Thanks very much, Paul, for the introduction. And of course, it's a great privilege to be with Dr. Sheena Greitens. We know each other from before. She came to visit me in Korea. I look forward to carrying on our conversation that we had in my office. We can now carry it on live. And it was a great conversation. You know, as we look at North Korea, I always advise caution on projecting anything as an expected outcome. North Korea is going to surprise us. Now, at the same time, there's some things that are observable that may be signals of where North Korea wants to go. Interestingly, yesterday or earlier today, Kim Jong-un announced an 80-day campaign. When he does that, he tends to really focus the attention of the North Korean people on some matter. And while he doesn't always accomplish what he set out to do, he does indeed create a harnessing of intellectual attention and public attention, and they move the ball forward in some way or another. Sometimes he does it to keep attention off of other problems, the things that are happening elsewhere in the world or the things that would attract his attention. So I think that this 80-day campaign is the first thing we ought to look at for North Korea. It so happens that the 80 days ends on December 25th. So this is Kim Jong-un's Christmas surprise. It has already begun. Now, what that will turn into, who knows? His emphasis is on economic development in areas that have been lagging. And it's very clear that Kim Jong-un still has the desire of pursuing his Byungjin policy of military capability development, including nuclear weapons, and economic development, with the ascendant one actually being economic development. And because he pursued the former, he has not been able to achieve the latter. Can't get the economic development going because of the significant sanctions that have been imposed on him. So for the next 80 days, the sanctions will continue. There'll be some places where the sanctions are tattered. We can talk about that later, perhaps. But North Korea will be concentrating internally. That's the message, I think, that comes out of this. And that is likely to be a function of the great duress that they've been under from sanctions, from flooding, from typhoons, and from COVID, all arriving at the same time. And as a result, the hermit kingdom has gone more hermit. And I think that's what we can expect for a while. So COVID clearly has a role in that. The election cycles in the United States and in the Republic of Korea all have an impact on that. They're, remember, just coming out of elections in South Korea to seat a National Assembly that has a supermajority with the Progressive Party. And now the U.S. elections are afoot. And then next year, we have the South Korean general election for a new president. This is the timing that North Korea is recognizing and need to buy 80 days.
Yeah, Clint, if I could maybe add a couple of things. I think that we are very much in a holding pattern certainly between now and the presidential election. And then my guess is that North Korea will probably wait a while after that to see how a transition shakes out, what messages the U.S. president gives, whoever that is, in terms of their approach to North Korea, what personnel take up the key Korea-related positions. And as General Brooks indicated, what the constellation of South Korean politics is, whether or not we see the presidential election really affirm the swing toward the Progressive Party that we saw in the April elections of this year. And so I think, that's the sort of the political calculus in both South Korea and in the United States that North Korea will be watching closely. But I think the other thing to notice is that COVID has really locked North Korea into some stasis and some isolation, maybe even more so than I think it probably wanted. I do think that COVID has had an impact in that it has led to, the efficacy of sanctions enforcement has probably gone up, not because of things related to the sanctions, but because of travel restrictions and border security being tightened because of COVID. And we've seen when North Korea has made references to redefectors or this most recent incident where it killed a South Korean and reportedly burned the body, that the explanation again given was about border security in the midst of this COVID crisis. But that pressure on North Korea's external economic relations, in particular cross-border trade with China, has combined with flooding, typhoons, natural conditions, and a perennial food insecurity that characterizes North Korea, to really, I think, put pressure on Kim Jong-un's argument and claim that he's been able to achieve anything close to the Byungjin line. They've got the nuclear part of this. That I think that part is Kim Jong-un can point to with more credibility right now than he can the economic prosperity and self-sufficiency half of the Byungjin line. And so, I think where we're seeing the pressure on the North Korean leadership is particularly to demonstrate that they can keep that balance, which is precisely the very thing that the sanctions were intended to say, no, you really can't have both equally. But COVID has really exacerbated that pressure on the regime. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing is an attempt to try to maintain some semblance of the Byungjin line at a time when the economy and normal people's livelihood is really strained. So I think we'll see stasis from the standpoint of a lot of external conditions, but the leadership maneuvering to try to deal with that to address the internal governance challenges that poses. And I would expect that would continue at least through early next year.
Thank you, Dr. Greitens. Yeah, that's the notion of stasis, or a holding pattern, as you put it. I think that's exactly how I described it yesterday to a reporter that asked me about the current state of affairs. And I characterize it as sort of a suspended state of animation. Obviously things are continuing to happen, but with COVID and the natural disasters, so to speak, and obviously the election, they're sort of holding pat and seeing how things go as they deal with these intense constraints. And thinking about elections, right? And this is something that the North Korean leadership has constantly adjudicated in the past. The negotiations with one administration, another administration comes in, often from a different party, and then it's like they start from scratch and things are totally changed. So this is part, I think, what motivates or disincentivizes any big moves at the moment, waiting to see what happens with the U.S. election. Some have speculated that they'll wait to see what happens, and that potentially one way or the other, whether it's a new administration with Biden or a second Trump administration, they may do something to get the U.S. leadership's attention, to try to bring them back to the table, or to get them back on the sort of mental map. And so it brings up the idea of potential escalation, which is what my second question's about. When we see escalatory situations on the Korean Peninsula, which unfortunately seems to be the only time we pay attention to it, we hear that all options are on the table. It's a commonly expressed phrase, and it's often used during these periods, such as in 2017. But there's always considerable pushback to the idea of actually using force against North Korea. So I want to ask both of you, General Brooks first, despite its rogue behavior, there's pushback against this. Why do you think this is? Are military options or responses to North Korea really a viable solution?
Well, the use of the military instrument as a part of our total instruments of national power is always viable, and I believe essential. So it becomes an anvil for creating the right kind of pressure to cause North Korea to bend in a different direction. It can become a hammer to very directly change the behavior of North Korea, but it's never effective if there's not a hand to wield it. And so there has to be something else. There has to be a fire to heat. There has to be a combination of instruments that are brought to bear. I'm metaphoring here for instruments of U.S. national power. We should never discount the potential use of the military. Indeed, military capability, when applied creatively and with some dexterity, can create inflection points that create traction for diplomacy, or create a deeper bite for economic activity, or open a door to something that wasn't open before. That's how we need to think about this. It's not an either or. It's not a now and then later. Diplomacy now, military later. If diplomacy fails, that would be a recipe for disaster. It must be diplomacy and military and economic activities simultaneously, and law enforcement and intelligence activities and information activities simultaneously applied. So are all options on the table? Yes, absolutely. Now, what does that mean? That means using the instrument deftly, as I just talked about, sending signals with military instruments, reinforcing signals from other categories. And it also means the full array of military capability we possess. We should not believe that that's not true. It is true. Now, there are many lines in that we would not want to go to. And that's where I think the pushback comes from, Clint, when you ask, why is there so much pushback on this idea of all options being on the table? Because no one wants to see that happen. Now, we've seen what happens when nuclear countries clash with each other, like Pakistan and India, and how frightening that can be for the consequences should it escalate out of the control of either side. And a conflict that resumes on the Korean Peninsula between the ROK-US alliance and North Korea, now possessing nuclear and intercontinental missile range, means the problem is bigger than the Korean Peninsula. That makes it very different from the way it was in 1953 when fighting stopped. It's much bigger now. And I think the consequences of that bigger are very, very different to the world as it's currently established. Instability comes from that. Economic collapse may come from that in a number of places. Underwriting of vessels in the Yellow Sea and the East Sea or the Sea of Japan will be different for commercial enterprises. Things get impacted if shooting starts. And that's why I think there's a lot of pushback on it. But that does not mean that the option is not available. What we want is to have among the options the ones that are less deadly, less destructive, and less likely to spiral out of control. We want those to be chosen. And they have to be available as options to national leaders in South Korea and the United States.
Dr. Greitens?
Yeah, I would second that in that, it is the responsibility of the American government and which includes the military, the United States military, to protect American lives and defend American interests. And so saying all options are on the table is simply the reality of what the American government, I think, is charged to do. But that doesn't mean, as General Brooks said, that that's the first place we go. That should be the idea that all options are on the table should not just mean the worst case option or the most costly option is on the table. It really should mean all options. And that includes a combination of financial measures, economic measures, diplomatic tools, multilateral engagement, the whole array of instruments of national power. I think we have to be very clear that we are talking about an adversary that over the course of the last 5 or so years has moved to the point of potentially being able to target the United States homeland. And that changes the calculus in terms of what's required for credible deterrent of North Korean action in some cases, right? And so that's a very, very serious threat that we all need to take seriously and think about how best to defend against. And having a credible military deterrent is a very, very important tool in preventing escalation. At the same time, that also means we need to be creative and very thoughtful about pursuing these other tools and making sure that in situations that could escalate, that we understand what the off-ramps are and how best to employ them. That requires careful signaling. It is helpful, I think, to talk to the North Koreans when the North Koreans want to talk, which is not all the time, as they're blowing up of the Inter-Korean Liaison Office a few months back suggested. But there's a place and a time for dialogue, for economic pressure, and for a lot of other tools. And so I think, what people are reacting to is that we really want to have a robust conversation about what all of the tools short of military force would be, or short of an all-out military conflict. Even in peacetime, the military has an important role to play on the Korean Peninsula, as General Brooks said, but it also means that we need to be paying attention to and engaging with questions of Korea policy when there's not an uptick or escalation in military activity. So in some ways, this is I think the ideal time to have these kinds of conversations, when things are at a lull, not in the middle of a crisis, because that's when we have time and the opportunity to think through different scenarios and the trade-offs associated with different policy options.
Thank you, Dr. Greitens. I love that last note. That literally speaks to why we're holding these events and sort of pushing this dialogue is not just when things could potentially blow up. Let's talk about it now. Let's talk about it before then.
Talk about it before we need it. Yes.
Before we need it. So we have a clear
all good planners want to do.
Yeah. Thank you. You're preaching to the choir for me, but I'm happy you're preaching it to the public as well. And you mentioned, both of you did, I at the start talked about the historical connectivity and why we have this commitment and its importance. And you both rightly pointed out that not only do those historical ties remain, but the issue sets involved have become that much more paramount and that much more pressing, and the costs of certain scenarios that much greater. And so I want to turn the focus a little bit to the U.S. South Korea alliance itself, which both of you touched on. And generally speaking, the U.S. mission on the Korean Peninsula is characterized as deterring North Korean aggression, and in the case of deterrence failure, assisting in the defense of South Korea. This does sound to maybe an ordinary American that the mission really is distant and over there. So why should Americans and Texans in particular care about what happens on the Korean Peninsula? And what, if any, is the larger value to the U.S. and U.S. national interests of the U.S. ROC alliance? And what would we stand to lose if the alliance were to be severed or to dissipate? And I might direct this to Dr. Greitens first.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really important question to think about. First of all, we can talk about some of just the basic statistics, right? There are 2 million Korean Americans, give or take, in the United States. South Korea is a really important trade partner to the United States, has been for a very long time. It's, top 5 to 10 trading partner, depending on measurements and which year and what you're looking at. So there are really important economic ties. There are really important cultural and people-to-people ties. I've talked about before my own family. I'm obviously not Korean American, but I have a sibling who is a Korean adoptee, my younger sister. And so I can think of 25 people to 60 people, depending on my, how you measure my extended family, right, who have been directly shaped by contact with the Korean Peninsula through my younger sister's adoption. And so, it's easy to think, oh, it's a place over there, but there are hundreds of thousands of Americans who have studied, worked, served in Korea, and many, many more who have never set foot in Korea, but whose lives have nevertheless been shaped by contact with Korean Americans, Koreans, or some other contact with the Korean Peninsula. And so I think it's really important to remember that is a living history. It's a history that is very much woven into the fabric of American lives and American cities today. But the other piece of this is just the more strategic answer, which is that the United States has for decades now deemed it critical to its own security and prosperity that there be both peace and stability in the Western Pacific. And so the United States has always pursued policies that are designed to keep its people safe, keep our country safe, both safe and prosperous, by creating the conditions for peace, development, and stability in East Asia. I think, the American presence in Korea, while imperfect, if you look over the course of decades of history, has been, I think, executed with that as an intent. And it's one of the reasons why it's so important that South Korea is the thriving democracy that it is today. That the U.S.-Korea alliance is now built on shared democratic principles and these people-to-people ties. But those are made possible in part by the security guarantees that the U.S.-Korea alliance involves and the shared project that the U.S. and South Korea have of peace on the Korean Peninsula and throughout, I think, the Indo-Pacific region. I guess I'd stop there, and I'm happy to follow up.
Yeah, Clint, if I can just pick up on that, I certainly agree with Sheena's points. We've got a long relationship there, a relationship that was forged in blood, that did not begin from being enemies or adversaries, and it has endured through years, and the impact of it is evident. Anyone who goes to Seoul, Korea, and lands at Incheon Airport can see the impact of a stable, long-term relationship with the United States. And it's their society, without a doubt, but helping to insulate them from the pressures of North Korea and the rest of the region during those years of rebuilding and regrowth and forming democracy and really letting democratic institutions seep in to overcome military dictatorship. All these things that happened during that time while we were standing beside them, shoulder to shoulder. That's the heart of the alliance. It's a go-together type of an alliance. Described in our national security documents as the linchpin of security in Northeast Asia. Try to pull a linchpin out of a wheel on a cart and see what happens. The whole thing tumbles. So it may not be the biggest relationship that we have, but as a linchpin, it is a critical relationship that we would pay a price to pull out of. And so I would say that there's a lot to be lost if the alliance relationship should break or if the alliance system should break. Remember, we have 7 alliances around the world, and 2 of them are in Northeast Asia, Japan and Republic of Korea. That alliance system is part of what has created stability and prosperity and a degree of security around the world, but especially in that region that's so important to much of the world. That would be potentially at risk. We have a resurgent China at the present time, which has strong muscles that are getting stronger all the time, and a long history of pushing smaller states on their borders to be obedient, and that's a term from some of their history, and they would engage in punishment for disobedience. That potential is always there for the shrimp that sometimes the Korean Peninsula is referred to as it sits between Japan, Russia, and China. All that is at stake. Our forward presence from a military perspective, forward presence on the Asian continent would be at stake should we reduce our presence or to have no presence and only hope to respond in a time of crisis. Folks, we tried that. Look at 1948 to 1950. South Koreans can handle it. If something happens, we'll be there with our naval and air forces and reinforce them with that. Well, okay, maybe we invited some of the war that happened in 1950, at least in part, creating a sense of opportunity or adventurism on the part of Kim Il-sung and on Russia, for that matter. These are the things that are in play. I don't want to make this all sound like a terrible case that North Korea is going to invade the day we leave and South Korea could never stand on its own. The conditions are not the same anymore. Remember, the city of Seoul is larger than the full population of North Korea now. That was not the case 40 years ago. The economies are not even comparable. You know, the 10th largest economy in the world and a basket case economy, which is North Korea. They're not even in the same part. Their language isn't the same anymore because of the American influence on culture and dialect in South Korea. They don't speak the same language as North Korea anymore. So there's a lot at stake and there's a lot invested and it is worth it. The final point is we keep our promises. All right, we just went through the anniversary of the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1953, signed on the 1st of October, 1953. Just passed that anniversary a few days ago. We keep our promises. And that's what I would say about it.
And if I could just add one more note, I was looking up a quick figure to make sure that I gave everybody watching and listening the correct numbers here. But when I first met General Brooks, it was on a trip to Korea in the fall of 2017, so very close to 3 years ago. And as part of that trip, one of the things that I did, this was part of a delegation from the state of Missouri, where I was serving as the First Lady at the time. And it's interesting to note that, you know, General Brooks and I met in Korea then, and both of our roles are different, and yet we're still here talking about Korea, which I think speaks to the wide applicability and the enduring importance of some of these questions. But what was incredibly moving at the time was to go and to lay a wreath in front of a wall that has a state-by-state list of Americans who went and fought in Korea and who gave their lives in defense of South Korea. And where I sit now in Austin, we're a stone's throw from the Capitol, where there's a Korean War monument. And I just looked up the numbers, right? Almost 300,000 Texans served in the Korean War, and about 1,700 people died in the course of that conflict. And so there are a lot of families who maybe it wasn't someone who served today, but whose grandparents or great-grandparents may have been closely involved in the defense of Korea. And so when we talk about that shoulder to shoulder element and history that's written in blood, it's a very real thing. And again, it's something that I think it's, it is abstract until you realize that it's a family member, a grandfather, somebody in your family whose life is a part of that tapestry, and that comes down to today. So I just wanted to add that I think those are the numbers that we're talking about. For the state of Texas in particular, but every state has a story like that. And recognizing that human element of the forward military presence is also, I think, just a really important humanizing factor.
Thank you, Sheena. Once again, you took literally the words out of my mouth. I was going to mention that specific number in the case of Texas. Not only the hundreds of thousands who served in the war, but the 1,779 who gave their lives in the Korean War. And it continues to this day. I as the general is aware, and Sheena, you likely are as well, several armored brigade combat teams from the 1st Cavalry Division stationed in Fort Hood have executed since 2015, I think, 9-month rotational deployments on the peninsula. So that direct involvement continues to this day from the state of Texas. Not to mention all the people-to-people connections you mentioned, including 92,000 Korean Americans who call the state of Texas their home. I want to turn a little bit to some of the nitty-gritty of the U.S. force presence. It was mentioned, and I characterize it similarly as well. That it's sort of the keystone in the arch, right? It's not the largest commitment or often characterized as the most important relationship, but if you pull that keystone out, the arch tumbles. And so, looking at that force presence of about 28,500 U.S. personnel. Does South Korea really need that number stationed there? And by now, some might ask, citing the very same factors that you mentioned, its economic success and growth, does Seoul really need those forces to defend itself against North Korea? And in fact, this is something that President Trump has said he wants to do, is to pull out or at least reduce the number of U.S. forces there, particularly in light of ongoing difficulties in alliance cost-sharing negotiations, the SMA talks. Can he do that? What are the potential consequences as you both see them? And why have the two sides not settled on an equitable cost-sharing agreement up to this point? General Brooks?
Well, first on the number, as you accurately described, we have troops from Fort Hood, Texas, and Fort Riley, Kansas, and other places where we have heavy brigades, and where we have combat aviation brigades equipped with the Apache helicopter, and where we have artillery units and signal units. Those are in different places of the United States, and they are rotational to Korea. In other words, they do a rotation. They belong to an installation or a unit that exists in the United States. They go for 9 to 12 months. The heavy brigade actually is a 12 month. Some of the other ones are shorter for 9 months. And then they return to their home base and maybe deployed to some other part of the world at a different point in time after that. So the 28,500 is the assigned number on Korea. That means people in units that don't exist anywhere else. They only exist on the peninsula. They don't have a home base in the United States. The rotational base on top of that brings the total up to about 30 to 34,000 at any given point in time. So the answer to the question is, do we need 28,500? No, you actually need more. That's why there are more there. That's why we have a rotational policy, because it takes more than that. What we chose to do several years ago, for example, I think it was 2005 or 6, the last of the combat brigades on the Korean Peninsula, this is the forces that engage in direct assault, it was deployed to, it was reduced from the structure. There had been 2 before that during my time when I was a commander over there in the 90s. One of them was deployed to Iraq, and then later we reduced the final one. So there's not a combat brigade stationed in Korea now. There's one rotating there. this is important to understand. Okay, so that's the first point. I don't want to take the numbers down further than that. The presence is principally Army and Air Force stationed there, forward deployed. And we will rotate additional forces several times during a given year from the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, and the United States Special Operations Command. So we have a lot of forces that are coming through Korea at a given point in time for presence, for familiarity, for relationships, etc. There are issues clearly on what each country believes is the appropriate level of cost sharing. And frankly, that we have a standing agreement with South Korea speaks volumes to the nature of the alliance. And by the way, they pay more on their money, for their own defense than any other country in the world that we are related to as an ally. Okay, by a long shot, somewhere between 2.7 and 2.8% of their gross domestic product, where the nearest other ally is somewhere around 1.9 or 2% and are being pushed. So South Korea is different from everyone else, but still there's controversy and discussion on what that amount should be. The issue of why it hasn't been resolved in my mind is candidly because of nationalism in both governments. And so nationalistic politics have ascended over the last several years, and as a result, that's a bit of a toxic mix when it comes to an alliance. Things that are about solving a problem together become dominated by national self-interest. And that's appropriate. That should always be part of the equation. But ultimately, a conclusion is made when there's some degree of subordination of national self-interest for collective interest. And that has not been the case. So at this point in time, neither country is yielding. And the negotiations are pretty well stalled. There's not much progress being made. And it will be interesting to see how that unfolds, whether a new administration will be able to do that or not, or current administration moves in a different direction. That's hard to say. I just want to finish the point here by saying that sometimes when we think about the bring our troops home, from a military perspective and from a budgetary perspective, I'll address it from these 2 points, and not from a political perspective, the cost is much greater to maintain them in the United States, to ship them to Korea for that 1 year period of time instead of having them live there constantly. It's much more expensive. The labor costs are more expensive in the United States than they are in South Korea, where labor is provided under this agreement by the South Korean government, where construction doesn't require an appropriation for military construction. I guess the last year's National Defense Authorization Act was some $730 billion. Well, how much more does that need to be to have construction funded by the United States and conducted overseas, where our troops would end up being? They've got to have a barracks. South Korea does that for us. It's not coming out of the U.S. budget. So the cost of coming home should not be misunderstood. Strategically, there are impacts to our presence in the United States and trying to have to fight our way into any place we would go. And economically, it is significantly more expensive and much more of a burden on our own economy. So I think that those points ought to be factored in and understood clearly.
Well, General Brooks just mentioned the point that I was going to bring up. So let me pivot and just add a very few short complementary points here. First on the numbers, the exact numbers are going to change over time. Right, we're going to have technological changes in the way that the U.S. military fights wars to win. We're going to have a natural evolution in the complementarity of roles between the U.S. military and the South Korean military. We've already seen all of that, right? And that's why these regular discussions and joint exercises and rotational presence and all of the things that General Brooks mentioned are so important, because we need to make sure that that is, in fact, the right structure and the right size force for the conditions on the Korean Peninsula and around the Korean Peninsula. Second, I do think it's really important to put South Korea's contributions into perspective. South Korea pays over 2.5% of its GDP, or spends more than 2.5% of GDP on its own defense. It is well above the NATO threshold, right, that has been controversial of late, right? So there's no question that South Korea is meeting the obligations that that we've put forth in other parts of the world. And it is, in fact, much cheaper for the United States to have forces in Korea where both infrastructure and much of the labor cost is funded by the South Korean government rather than being funded out of the U.S. budget. So all of that is to say, I agree generally with the assessment of why this has become a deadlock point. But to me, all of those factors really militate toward urgently resolving this as soon as possible. I think it's unfortunate that this has become such an obstacle in the U.S.-Korea alliance, and that so much attention is being paid to the SMA and the cost-sharing agreement as opposed to the other urgent national security challenges that the alliance needs to address and has to address. The last thing is just to say that I would, having given all those facts and figures about, the economic logic and the way the cost sharing structure actually works, let me just also say that, there are long-term benefits that we talked about to the U.S.-Korea alliance. And having a durable alliance means that there are going to be specific individual transactions where if you take them out of context, they're going to look like they don't go the US's way. Or frankly, there are going to be pieces of that interaction that might look like they're not always accruing to South Korea's interest, right? The very nature of an alliance, which is a multi-year, in this case, multi-generational cooperation and partnership, is that both sides give and take for the sake of the bigger project, which is shared security and shared stability. And in this case, also shared democracy and freedom on the Korean Peninsula. And so I think it would be a mistake to sort of look at this and say, okay, in year 2020, did the economic logic accrue, net to the United States benefit? Because it's not zero sum. And it's also not no single year and single issue, such as the financial cost, is going to be the right way to think about the alliance. This is also an investment that the United States is making in its ability to deal with a rare event. So in some ways, it's a little bit like insurance, right? You invest in something that is intended to either prevent or help you more capably deal with an eventual crisis. Now, we all hope the crisis in terms of conflict or an emergency on the Korean Peninsula never materializes, but we also want to make sure that we've invested what we need in the capability to deal with it. And that capability is not just technology, it's not just the sort of logistical, tactical, operational facility or ability of the United States military. It's also relational and about that, the political and the cooperative ability to operate with the South Korean military and the South Korean government. So I guess I would just end with a word of caution on being too transactional about the alliance itself, because I think that misses the larger strategic picture, which involves this thinking of this as more of an investment to deal with and hedge against a rare and catastrophic event that we hope doesn't come, but we nevertheless need to prepare for.
Thank you, both of you. Those were incredibly comprehensive answers. The only thing that I would add on to that is, and it's been sort of alluded to, in terms of long-term investment, the U.S. force presence has been there for the entirety of South Korea's national existence, but for 1 year, and that was June of 1949 to the outbreak of the Korean War. And so I think when we look at it in that longer sweep of history, of course, the numbers have been adjusted and drawn down over time. But when we look at it in that long sweep of history, some folks ask, well, we've been there for so long, it's about time to leave. My perspective is there's a reason we've been there that long. And having been there that long, and for the security architecture had been characterized by that presence for so long, is not something that you want to precipitously sort of fiddle with, is my own editorializing there. Thank you to all our attendees. Thank you, Dr. Greitens. Thank you, General Brooks, and to KDVA as well for your ongoing sort of partnership and assistance.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.